Oh no, there's spoilers ahead. If you don't want to be spoiled for Undertale, you should click away and watch something else instead. The video essay starts in 3, 2, 1. Undertale is a good game and I liked it. Sure, it's not everyone's cup of coffee or tea or whatever, and the appeal of the game is mainly in the story and not the gameplay, and yes, even the story itself has some problems, but for the most part I thought it was good. The gameplay itself wouldn't really be that engaging on its own, considering that it's the most basic example of gameplay in the respective genres it takes from, but the way that the narrative plays with and contextualizes that gameplay is what makes the game entertaining, at least to me. So there's already been quite a bit written and said about Undertale, and the discussion has mainly been revolving around how it breaks conventions.
It's also built from the ground up, almost as an engine itself for subverting RPG cliches.
It actually does just playfully toy with video game convention.
And I'm not here to say that the discussion hasn't been interesting, or that even what I have to say here is more interesting than what's already been said, or even that what I have to say here probably hasn't already been said somewhere else on the internet anyway. But the thing is, I find how this game supposedly breaks conventions to be less interesting than how it uses conventions to set player expectations in order to make its significant story moments have all the more impact on the player. I could probably sit here and write about the whole game from beginning to end, but because I live in reality where frustratingly I can't reset everything to take my time and decisions back if I regret them, I'll just have to settle for the first level. So the player starts the game and names their character probably something stupid. They are then immediately thrown into the game world and are presented with a black background and only one possible path to walk down, which leads them into a room with a talking flower who offers to explain the game to them. Now, despite its simplicity, I actually find the design of this first encounter quite interesting. For the majority of players, when they first encounter Flowey, they will be told that they have to gain level or love or whatever by absorbing friendliness pellets, nicely presented to us in quotation marks, and without questioning anything will run their soul straight into the bullets and get called an idiot. Now, assuming that you didn't cheat and look up their Let's Play beforehand, it is actually possible to avoid this on your first playthrough, as there are a couple of subtle clues that can lead you on that Flowey here isn't to be trusted. But they're sort of abstract gamey clues that you'll only notice if you're thinking about the game's design. First of all, Flowey pulls you into this screen, and you don't have to have played Undertale before to recognize this as a battle screen. Your level and health bar appear at the bottom, and the top of the screen is dominated by a portrait of Flowey looking directly at you as though you're staring down your adversary. This should be especially obvious to anyone who's actually played Earthbound. Even if you haven't, it's general game design wisdom that if a health bar appears on screen, then that communicates to the player that they are in a situation where they can take damage. The second clue as to Flowey's deception is that what he's explaining just doesn't make any sense to anyone familiar with how video games work. In what game would an NPC drag you into an intimidating looking screen like this and tell you to run your soul into little white pellets in order to level up your love? That's not a game mechanic. Nevertheless, players are still inclined to believe Flowey because he's just offered to be our tutorial, and gaming wisdom says that tutorials are safe places for players to become accustomed to oh dear. So not only did Flowey trick you and straight up call you an idiot, but in the back of your mind you think that he may be right, given that his sudden but inevitable betrayal seems so obvious to you in retrospect. Riddle me this: what makes you saltier than a person calling you an idiot? The answer is a person calling you an idiot and being able to back it up with an example of you being easily tricked like one of us flawed, squishy mortals. Also, Flowey's theme song is fucking annoying. Incidentally, if you actually do dodge his pellets, he not only calls you out for knowing prior, but you also miss out on two important bits of his dialogue, so it's probably intended for the majority of players to fall for this trick. This moment does two things. For the story, it makes you hate Flowey, actually more so than if he had simply come out of nowhere and kidnapped your girlfriend or something like in Super Mario or whatever. But for the gameplay, it makes you start paying attention and thinking experimentally, which is an integral mindset to take with you for the rest of the game. This is where I should probably say that I'm not attempting to argue that this is necessarily how every player will experience the game. Games, more so than other forms of fiction, can obviously be experienced differently by every person who engages with them. What I'm trying to do here is describe how I think the design of the encounters in Undertale's first level will generally try to influence a player's experience of the game. And if you disagree with me or had a different experience to the one I'm describing, then fair enough. If you feel so compelled, write a comment or shoot me an email or something. So the first dungeon in the game takes place, and this character, who I guess is supposed to be a satire of a typical video game tutorial, literally holds your hand through puzzles that aren't even hard and can't actually harm you at all, and then she leaves you alone to explore the rest of the dungeon yourself. Presumably at this point, the player is aware of the morality mechanics to this game and knows that you can either spare or kill monsters that attack you. If they haven't been tipped off that killing any enemy at all locks them out of the true ending, then they'll presumably experiment with this dynamic a little bit after they notice that letting monsters go grants them no EXP, which in any other RPG is a token that you want to accumulate. Killing a few grunt monsters, especially early into a game, wouldn't really be that much of a big deal to a typical video game player. Games with morality systems such as Bioshock, Mass Effect, Infamous, and the other usual suspects are usually so rigidly binary that you can do a laundry list of awful things and still be declared a good person by the end of the game because you racked up on good karma points. And Undertale knows that players will be coming into this game expecting their actions to have a certain degree of impermanence, which gets played with a bunch over the course of the game. Anyway, the player meets up with Toriel at her house, does a bit of exploring and reading text prompts, and gets given a cinnamon butterscotch pie as a strong healing item, which is so unbelievably cruel in two ways. In the story, the player's next boss fight is Toriel, who just gave you the pie, which you have an opportunity to use against her in the battle, adding to the dramatic irony of the situation. Gameplay-wise, giving the player a strong healing item right before a boss battle tells the player that they're going to seriously need to manage their health, which tricks the player into thinking Toriel will kill them in the fight. The full heal also extends the amount of time the player will spend in the battle before they realize that Toriel will deliberately avoid hitting you once you're at low health. The illusion of needing health management also places a sense of urgency on the player to figure out a solution to the fight as quickly as possible, which means players aren't inclined to try something they think doesn't work. This is important because for the first couple of tries, it really does look like trying to spare Toriel isn't the solution. So the pie both creates this sense of urgency for the player and gives them more time before they see that there is no real urgency to the situation. Fucking brilliant. At this point, players will probably decide to try hitting Toriel to low health without killing her because it works in Pokemon, I guess. But that plan goes awry when the player unintentionally delivers an unavoidable critical hit out of nowhere. So Toriel delivers a creepy speech and dies all dramatic-like. At this point, the player might feel cheated because there was a lack of perceivable consequence or something and decide to save scum. Even if they don't do it immediately, there's this long-ass hallway in between the door and the next room, which lets the player stew in their feelings of guilt or whatever else a bit after killing Toriel and then, you again. Flowey tries to clue the player into save scumming by telling them that they can't go back and change fate with a suspicious smirk on his face. Some players will probably continue on anyway, but eventually every player who killed Toriel is going to have to come back in order to complete the game. And you'd be surprised how many of my friends told me that they killed Toriel and continued on, only for one of their other friends later to tell them to restart the game from the beginning again. So the player goes back and there's some new dialogue that they may or may not skip over. They start the fight with Toriel again, and provided they didn't cheat by looking up the solution on the internet, this time they know that the fight button doesn't work. So they steer clear of that and try other things, maybe fleeing? At which point the game says, "Us, you are the future of humans and monsters." So the player goes back, tries talking, and then the game basically tells the player they have to spare Toriel. The less obvious clue to this is that a frogget from earlier has told the player that selecting spare is an abstract way of verbally telling the monsters that you won't fight them. So by selecting spare over and over again, what the player is actually doing abstractly is talking down Toriel by repeatedly expressing to her verbally that they don't want to fight her, presumably in different ways, or I don't know. Forcing the player to make up their own dialogue for a silent protagonist, as it turns out, is an RPG convention that Undertale falls back on quite comfortably. Nevertheless, this gets the player to think abstractly about what their inputs are actually representing in the game space, which is the kind of mindset you really need to be in to fully appreciate the nonsense that is playing baby's first Toho with your soul as a battle mechanic in an RPG. So anyway, the player figures out the puzzle and Toriel is alive and well, but it's kind of a hollow feeling victory. I mean, the player was kind of cheated on that choice, and they had to save scum in order to pass the puzzle correctly, so this time when they walk down that long-ass hallway, they may be stewing in a feeling of salty resentment that they might have tarnished their playthrough a little bit, and then they meet Flowey again, and he says, Several lines here suggest that the player is intended to see this monologue of Flowey's on either their first or second playthrough, as he reveals quite a few details that clue into future story events that aren't revealed if the player passes the Toriel fight on their first try. But the big thing here is that Flowey breaks the fourth wall and reveals to the player that not only does the game remember what you do in between saves, but that the save file is an element in the game's story. And because the player has to save scum in order to get to this point, they feel like they just got caught cheating. And that's when they get delivered to the title screen and the main section of the game finally finally begins. Incidentally, there's another long walk after the grand reveal to let the player further stew in their thoughts before the light-hearted comedy starts with the Skeleton Brothers. So to summarize, Undertale breaks a lot of video game conventions, yes, but it also uses others deliberately in order to play with player expectations. It does this throughout the entire game, but the best examples, I think, are in the tutorial level. The fight with Flowey uses conventions surrounding tutorials and heads-up displays to introduce the antagonist of the story by tricking the player. The fight with Toriel uses conventions surrounding boss battles to pressure the player into making a choice they didn't want to. Finally, the game uses conventions surrounding retro aesthetics and NES-style button layouts to conceal the game's most unique story feature. You don't expect the game to be tracking your behavior in between loads because these lo-fi visuals, chiptune sounds, and simple button layout trick you into thinking that the game isn't that technically impressive, until you remember that you're playing it on PC, and this is totally something a PC can do extremely easily. Most games track heaps of data in between saves, but that data is usually in the form of statistics, unlockable extras, or achievements, and it doesn't take that much of a logical leap to apply it to a game's story as well. But you don't expect it from Undertale, not just because the overwhelming majority of games don't do this, but because the graphics and sound make you subconsciously underestimate it, giving it more room to surprise you. Or at least that would be the case if you didn't go into this game knowing it's the top-rated PC game of all time on Metacritic, or had it recommended to you by an overzealous fan proclaiming it to be the best game released this year to ramp up your expectations. Anyhow, that's about it for now, but if you'd like to see more content like this from me, then let me know in the comments and share this video around. Thanks for watching.